Greetings, friends. The other day, Dusk released a video where he argues that if you want to preserve Western civilization, you have to do the intellectual work of learning about Western culture and history. He mentions Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy like Cicero, Epictetus. He mentions Shakespeare. He mentions studying languages, especially Latin, but also German. Of course, English, Old English, the classics like Beowulf, all of those great works of literature. The point of doing this homework is so you can understand the West and therefore preserve it, presumably by teaching it to others. But he says that the average white nationalist, he uses the term a keyboard warrior, doesn't do this homework. They focus on talking about the simple issues about having lots of white babies, securing the borders, and a few other concrete issues to do with our immediate circumstances. And neither Dusk nor myself argue against those things, but he says that it's not enough. I agree with what Dusk is saying. It's common sense. Most young men in our current times are very ignorant of Western culture and history. I would add that it's usually a particular class of men that receive this education, but that doesn't really affect, his argument. It still makes sense. So if I agree with what Dusk is saying, why am I responding to it? Well, I was struck by what he didn't say. He didn't mention the Bible, nor did he mention much spiritual literature at all. True, he mentioned Dante's Inferno, and yes, those Greek and Roman philosophers, they certainly had spiritual views. That's inescapable. I don't think that was their main focus, though. 90% of his recommended readings were secular material. If something is secular, then it relates to worldly things. Something secular is definitely not regarded as religious, spiritual, or sacred. Dusk is basically suggesting an atheistic reading list. Many smart people, many philosophers are atheists. A good example would be Stefan Molyneux. Molyneux loves his Greek philosophy because it gives him a system for defining truth, something he can control, something he can master. To improve this reading list and make it a bit more spiritual, I would put the Bible near the top, if not in first place. I would include Martin Luther, maybe John Calvin, perhaps Milton, William Blake, Nostradamus for sure, Carl Jung for sure. I'm trying my best to read in these subjects, but it takes time, it takes years. Obviously, not everyone can do this. I'd rather be just as focused with non-secular material as with secular material. I'm obsessed with history, and history is secular, although if you read the Bible, there's going to be history in that, and Nostradamus is making predictions of future history, but so maybe there's a bit of a gray line in there. But generally, when it comes to history, you have to decide what is more important, because you only have so much time to utilize in life. So, the slave revolt in Haiti is interesting and arguably of some importance, but not so important as the American Revolution. Reading about the spread of the potato to Ireland and other parts of Europe is not as important as, for example, reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But apart from secular history, philosophy, economics, and all that stuff, there has to be some spiritual story to fill the foundations, and that means embracing elements of mystery, which atheists hate doing, because it means surrendering their analytical power. You need that mythic, subconscious stimuli of fascinating, strange, moving stories, filled with archaic symbols. The kind of stuff that gives Jordan Peterson a boner. Then there are guys like Luther and Jung who help us make sense of it all. They're slightly more rational, but not all the way. On the other hand, if you educate young men without a spiritual underpinning, they'll soon give up hope on the inside. They won't see the point in striving, although many atheists will agree and say, I work very hard, but I'm telling you, that flame will go out. The passion dies before it has a chance to thrive. Certainly, Western culture has always been spiritual. Dusk and Molyneux loved the ancient Greeks and Romans, but those peoples were spiritual too. They believed in a soul. They offered sacrifices to gods. Maybe those gods were demonic, but that's beside the point. After the fall of these civilizations, Christianity drove the West forward. Christian monks in medieval times preserved much of the ancient writings and added their own. The modern nations of Canada and the United States were born as much in Christianity as they were born in whiteness. If you look at secular history, you will see that no civilization has ever been atheistic. There is no precedent for an atheistic civilization ever being able to survive. What we're seeing now is new in recorded history. Perhaps it could have happened before. Perhaps you can point to the end of the Roman Empire and say it was becoming kind of atheistic. But of course, not fully, and people still believed in the gods and all that stuff, but were they really honoring the gods? Again, I didn't do my homework enough, but certainly there was still that spiritual element there, but I would definitely venture to guess that there was more of a pursuit of the self, away from any external obligations or transcendent realities. We know that homosexuality was rising at that time, decadence, diversity. The Germans were allowed into the Rome, and they took over the army. Many of the current things we're seeing today. It begs the question, is atheistic actually not a belief in a god, or is it a worship of the self? Is it demonic? Are they just worshiping something different? Maybe it's a bit of a gray line there. Speaking of diversity and decline, you know who across the street just started blaring loud reggae music. Stand up for your rights. No woman, no cry. And it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No more daylight for me, because I blocked that window. Some say China and Japan are examples of atheistic societies, but I don't buy it. Confucianism in China never snuffed out or fully replaced spirituality. It's just a secular framework which was imposed on top. Many Chinese identify as atheist on surveys, but that just means they don't identify with an organized religion, and spirituality is much more broader than that. Natural forces are definitely a more part of their outlook. They worship their dead ancestors. This is still very common in China. And regardless, even organized religions like Taoism, to an extent Buddhism, are still very much a part of the fabric in East Asia, and Christianity is the fastest growing religion in that part of the world. 10, 15 years from now, there's going to be much more Christians. East Asian societies are also highly nationalistic and collectivist. One of the most famous atheists, Sam Harris, he's alarmed at this rise of populism around the world, especially in the United States. When you get into nationalism, you encounter passion, myth, history, and archetypes, and from there it's not a far step into spirituality, religion, or whatever non-secular outlook you may call it. I could be wrong about that specific point. Maybe some peoples are just nationalistic and not really religious or spiritual. I mean, look, I mentioned Jordan Peterson. He's very much an individualist, doesn't understand the rise of white identity politics, or doesn't believe in any identity politics. We should all be libertarians. And I hear this term libertarianism a lot. I've tried to understand it, and I just can't understand it. Maybe someone can illuminate me. I spent time on libertarianism.org, a nice organization, reading through their library and I got into Adam Smith, and I read about the Great Depression under Roosevelt and all the crazy stuff he did, and at the end of the day, I'm just like, well, I mean, you're either liberal on certain issues or you're conservative on certain issues. This is just it's just a fantasy, but if you can explain it to me better, I'll change my mind. I mean, you could say libertarianism is the suspicion of the government. We need small government. Well, yeah, I guess, but that's fairly simplistic. I mean, isn't that a conservative belief? Isn't that what the Founding Fathers believed? Or perhaps the Founding Fathers were actually kind of radical, because Canada was formed by loyalists, people who were so conservative that they didn't mind being financially exploited or not knowing what the King of England might eventually do. They wanted to stay a subject to the King of England so much that they left the United States and formed their own colony, Upper Canada. So anyways, yeah, I mean, maybe not always nationalism becomes spirituality, but I think if you look at history, generally they tend to go together. I mean, look at Eastern Europe. Christianity is clearly part of that culture there. There'll be all kinds of comments telling me I don't know what atheism is, because atheism is merely the lack of belief in a God. Well, I wish it were that simple, because then you could really convince them of their error, because any worldview depends on fundamental axioms, which is no different than belief in God. Saying that God is a supernatural being who tells you what to do is a childish caricature. The concept of God can't be contained like that. Now, when it comes to the Jews, I know that's sort of a borderline question. Are they technically part of Western history and culture? I mean, Christianity came from the Jews in the Middle East, but it started a new culture which thrived in Europe. There were Jews, of course, historically in Europe, minorities, but I know that's a bit of a borderline question, because Europe, we think of a different peoples, the Germanic peoples, the Roman peoples, the Celtic peoples. But, just forget that for now. I'm just talking about the concept of God, which we do share something in common between Christianity and Judaism. For the devout Jews, they're not even supposed to pronounce his name, except in certain situations. And that's to keep it from becoming profane. Yet that's exactly how many atheists think of God, a silly old man in the sky. It's remarkably naive. But to be fair, there's different kinds of atheists, and they say all sorts of different things, but I think they're unified by this distaste for the spiritual. And they may disagree and say, oh, of course, I'm in favor of spirituality, but they run mental gymnastics in defining their version of spirituality, which makes my head spin. I was even told by one atheist that he believes in a soul, one which is rooted in this physical world, whatever that means. One YouTuber I recommend is Red Pill Germany. He does politics, MGTOW-themed topics, but he's not afraid of spirituality, and as a very educated, very intelligent engineer, he's not ashamed to admit that he's a Catholic. And he made a favorable video about the life of Martin Luther, which is impressive because Martin Luther wasn't so friendly to the Catholics. And Dusk, who knows Red Pill Germany, where they've collaborated, and he left a comment fairly short saying Luther was a very destructive force in Europe. And of course he was referring to the religious wars which resulted from the Protestant Reformation sparked by Luther. But of course, this is a very skewed outlook to take, because Luther's time was filled with upheavals. There were many radicals at that time. I recently finished a book with selections of Martin Luther's most important writings. He makes a very good case, although he can be repetitive at times. Luther did support some of these peasant revolts, but when he saw how they behaved, how they massacred people, behaved unlike Christians, he opposed many of them, and he even wrote treatises explaining why good Christians should obey the authorities. In the near future, I'm going to do a video talking about why Luther was so incensed at the Roman Catholic Church. What exactly was the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church at that time? Most Western men aren't going to do this homework. They don't want to, and that's fine. They're too busy working to stay alive, or they're just not intellectuals, and that's a natural state of affairs. We bookworms are the privileged few who get to sit on accumulated wealth. The unspoken social contract and the truth we knew deep down inside was that we must use our time to study and to either teach or produce what may be called mind works for the rest of society. As for what gets taught, only a rudimentary knowledge of history and philosophy is realistic to convey to the common man. However, when it comes to spiritual matters, all of society should have a basic education. A lawyer knows all about the law, but he may not know anything about his own soul. In the past, once the Bible was translated into vernacular languages, or even before Christianity, when the bards would tell their stories and sing their songs to the crowds, then all classes of people could access this information. You need as many people as possible to share some passion, some minimum degree of identification with the common culture. Every culture must have some mystery elements, some axioms which can't be reduced any further. One of these axioms is that there's life after death. Another is that everyone gets their just desserts. These are just some examples. Whatever they are, belief in these axioms has more to do with passion, with something we feel intuitively. If we lose this passion, this intrinsic trust, once too many flames go out, then the whole system comes down. You end up with famous biologist and author Richard Dawkins admitting to a crowd that he has no problem with female incest. If you don't believe me, I'll leave a link in the description. Dawkins could find no rational reason to oppose it. Sanctioning female incest is just one symptom of the decline that atheism causes. There are many others. Hasta luego, amigos.